The war had its origins in Europe, but while there was a lot of fighting within that continent, it was a global conflict from the beginning. At the start of the war, the Japanese Empire was already locking horns with Germany and China and the Pacific Islands. And when the Ottoman Empire, which stretched from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf, joined in late 1914, it truly became a world war. There were naval battles in the South Pacific and South Atlantic. Soldiers from every continent except Antarctica would fight. There were fronts in Persia, Mesopotamia, Libya, even the borders of India, and fighting all over Africa as European colonies changed hands. Towards the end of the war, the United States and Brazil would also join in the fighting. It was the first truly global war and the largest in history at the time. Germany, and especially Kaiser Wilhelm II, dreamed of a greater colonial empire and a greater German hegemony in the concert of Europe. A big concern for Germany was the expansion of the Russian railway system. In 1914, German Chancellor von Bethmann-Hollweg stated that within 3 years, Russia would be able to mobilize troops so quickly that the German advantage in technology would not be able to overcome the Russian advantage in manpower. To win the war, they had to act quickly. What Germany feared was a war on two fronts, so their battle plan was to defeat France and then focus the entire German military might on the Russian Empire. As the most multicultural of all the great empires, Austria-Hungary had 15 different language versions of its national anthem. While its internal workings, that often valued heritage over ability, left it somewhat in a state of decay by 1914, the empire still dreamed of expanding its influence throughout the Balkans and perhaps one day all the way to Persia. In 1908, Austria-Hungary had annexed Bosnia, making Serbia the next in line, and if Serbia fell, Russia would lose all influence in the Balkan region. Although the 600-year-old Ottoman Empire was huge, stretching from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf, it was in decay and had lost wars to both Italy and a Balkan alliance in the years preceding the First World War. However, the Ottoman Empire would still prove to be a formidable opponent, with the Young Turks movement and the institution of a constitutional government having paved the way for modernization in all aspects of life, including the military. Minister of War Enver Pasha, one of the 3 Pashas who basically ran the empire during the war, dreamed of a modern Turkish nation that did not look to the Arab world for guidance, but looked to itself. His dream would one day come true, but he would not live to see it. In 1914, a quarter of the world was controlled by the British Empire, and the colonies were secured by Britain's supreme naval power. At the time, the British Army was quite small compared to the other European powers, but it was the only fully professional regular army in Europe, and the soldiers were highly efficient despite their small numbers. Fearing the expansion of German influence, Britain guaranteed Belgium's neutrality, meaning that an attack on Belgium was an attack on Britain, and all the corners of the global empire would join the fight. By 1910, the United States had become the world's leading industrial power. Though they remained neutral for the first few years of the war, American industry and finance played a major role. Initially, American reaction to the war was mixed. While the greatest number of immigrants in the States were from Britain, including Ireland, Germans were second, and there was sympathy for both sides. However, when the war began, Britain cut Germany's transatlantic cable, so all American reports of the war were routed through Britain, and only what was favorable passed the censors. Also, events like the sinking of the ocean liner Lusitania and the execution of Edith Cavell inflamed the American public, and the war with Germany soon loomed large. In 1914, Russia still bore scars from its humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-05, and the numerous workers' strikes of the 1905 revolution gnawed at the foundations of Tsarist rule. The autocratic Tsar Nicholas II was unwilling to change Russia's obsolete political system, one which widened the gap between the poor and oppressed, the majority of the people, and the small minority of bourgeoisie and aristocratic landowners. The prospect of an external enemy, however, seemed to unite all of Russia once again behind its leader. The rising pan-Slavic ideology fitted together with Russia's foreign policy that sought to gain influence in the Balkans and to extend its reach along the Black Sea and towards Constantinople. Russian geopolitical ambitions there naturally clashed with the interests of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Russia had a population of nearly 170 million, but over 90% of them lived and worked in agricultural societies, and nationwide industrialization had not been possible without foreign help and money. Germany had turned its back on Russia to strengthen its ties with Austria-Hungary. Consequently, Russia arranged economic deals with France, which in turn led to a military alliance between the two. These alliances meant that a war between the Russian and the Austro-Hungarian empires over issues in the Balkans would inevitably drag in France and Germany. A war that not even the deep affinity between the two royal cousins, Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas, would be able to stop once mobilization began. Italy had been an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, but when it broke out in 1914, they claimed that the alliance was only a defensive one, and Italy had no obligation to join an offensive war. However, 1 year later, Italy joined the war siding with the Allies, hoping to reclaim lost Italian lands that were now part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Italian front was characterized by mountains. The amount of soldiers wounded compared to killed was far greater there than other fronts, because stray bullets would splinter the rock into deadly projectiles that were particularly dangerous to eyes and faces. Europe, before the Great War, is often described as tranquil and peaceful. But in the decades before the Great War broke out, there had been Balkan Wars, the Russo-Japanese War, terrorism, assassinations, and increasing demands for civil rights and self-governance throughout the empires. And so, when Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot, at first it barely caused a ripple. In Britain and France, it was seen as just another political assassination in a far-off corner of Europe where things like that happened. It was certainly not a reason to go to war. But all the nations who went to war did have other reasons, and as it turned out, that assassination was the perfect foil to make the dominoes fall. Austria-Hungary wanted an empire to the Mediterranean. Russia wanted influence in the Balkans. Germany feared Russian economic expansion and also wanted a larger global empire. France wanted back the lands it had lost to Prussia. Britain wanted to curb German expansion, especially naval and colonial expansion, while preserving its own worldwide empire. Some leaders also saw war as a way to silence the protests and boost nationalism. But it wasn't just political, war was big business. Someone would have to supply the troops, to produce the weapons, ammunition, and uniforms. Those someones would make fortunes. It's no secret that the war created tens of thousands of millionaires, and it's no secret either that many business leaders urged their governments to war in 1914. When the modern combustion engine was first developed in the 1880s, few realized how much it would change the global economy. But over the next decades, in every shipyard, it became obvious that oil power was superior to coal in every way. A motor could now reach full power in 30 minutes instead of 6 hours. It required a fraction of the men to run it, and a ship's range increased fourfold. Even before the war, the dreadnoughts of the mighty British Navy had begun to convert to oil power, but oil was to be found far from British shores. Much of the British war effort in the Middle East was to protect British oil supplies, the Suez Canal transport route, and to take or destroy the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, Germany's oil supply line to the Ottoman Empire. As the war progressed, and the airplane, the car, the submarine, and the tank were produced in greater and greater numbers, oil became ever more important. As the great empires of Europe went to war, so did their colonies throughout the globe. France brought Zouaves from Africa to Flanders. Britain brought in Canadians, South Africans, Anzacs, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and Gurkhas from India. In Africa, German colonial troops, the Schutztruppe, fought for their existence against Belgian, British, French and Portuguese attackers. Russia brought troops from Siberia to Europe. The Chinese Labour Corps worked behind the lines on the Western Front, and war flared throughout the Middle East. Millions of men from every corner of the globe fought in what was truly the First World War. No other war in history had brought such change so quickly as World War I. It's been said that between 1914 and 1918, the world went from 1870 to 1940. And in many ways it is true. Men rode into war on horses and rode out of it in tanks. In August 1914, old school met new as infantry marched out en masse in brightly coloured uniforms against machine guns. The new school won. Airships and airplanes sailed the skies. Submarines and battleships prowled the seas. And the biggest gun of all, the Paris gun, fired shells that were the first man-made objects to reach the stratosphere. Stormtroops, the creeping barrage, chemical warfare, the psychological warfare of bombing civilians far from the front. These were the hallmarks of the First World War. Even things we take for granted today, like the zipper, radio communications, sanitary napkins and soya sausages, became everyday conveniences because of the war. And medicine made greater progress in those 4 years than at any other time or after. As the victors redrew the map after the war, many countries we know today emerged. The post-World War was, in every respect, a new world.